As Mickey said, central Minnesota, oftentimes people don't think that, these issues are impacting our community. And, oftentimes people talk about the pipeline, the 169 pump pipeline, the 371 pipeline, the pipeline. And I'm not talking about oil at this time, although that's part of the issue. We know that too, but the pipeline of sex trafficking, with our young women, and even our young boys, from Minnesota to Duluth over to North Dakota. And so rural communities really are a factor in this conversation. But, when we think about intergenerational trauma, we think about, just the relocation of our tribal people, um, the history of the boarding schools. We know that those were Christian boarding schools, the violations that took place there with clergy, with priests, with nuns, just with those entire systems. And then just the historical trauma and isolation and memory, embodied memory, that has continued for a really long time. You think about, the elders, my sisters and brothers-in-laws that are in their, 70s and 80s, are byproducts of the boarding school. And our community remembers well those traumas that were inflicted, and how does that play out into this particular issue? Um, we still have a lot of people that are pretty numb and impacted by all of those traumas, and trying to parent sometimes our kids when we're unable to talk about some of the um, pain, rage, terror, memories of what took place. Um, our kids oftentimes grow up not having the ability to talk at times too about some of the things that are difficult, and end up getting sort of lost in that process. We also know currently that there's violation by helpers. We've got at times a vulnerable community. We've got, individuals that are trying to find themselves in terms of their own recovery, their identity, and finding and looking for safe places and safe people. And oftentimes there are those predators out there that, portray themselves either self-identified spiritual leaders, or even recognized spiritual leaders that do prey upon those that are more vulnerable, especially, people that are kind of looking for that hope and looking for that safety, and looking sometimes even for that cultural connection. In our community, we see a lot of trauma in our community, as indicated in the story that I helped write. I'm a grandmother of a murdered granddaughter. We lost our granddaughter at 23 years old 5 years ago. It was horrible. It was tragic. The isolation, the judgmentalness from the community. I'm a college administrator. I've been an elected official in our community. I have served on hospital boards, foundation boards, and people don't know what to say to you when you've experienced that sort of trauma. They don't know how to talk. They don't know how to grieve with you. And so I think about, here I am, a pretty connected woman, a pretty connected family, and yet people don't, and I've got those resources to reach out, and yet people don't know how to talk, right? So I think about the isolation, the loneliness, and the pain and the trauma that those that don't have connections like my family has been fortunate enough to have, must feel. My um, my auntie was also referenced in our story, Ruby Keg. That's my mother's sister, and Ruby was killed in front of the Mille Lacs Trading Post Museum right here on 169, many, many years ago. But that was something that, mom and the others just didn't talk about, even to her death. My mom's passing, they didn't want to talk about Aunt Ruby and how she was sexually assaulted and left for dead. My cousin lost a first cousin down in Minneapolis to murder. And again, our families don't talk about all of that because there's been so much pain, there's been so much trauma, that it's sometimes just too raw because it's so connected to the other traumas that, many of our families have experienced. By nature, when I think about my cultural teachings, we're kind of a conflict avoidant people, right? And we as children oftentimes don't get taught to use our voices. We listen, we observe a lot. And so part of our work is around how do we help our young people learn how to use their voices, so they can ask for help, so they can self-advocate, so on and so forth. We're also taught to not speak bad about the deceased. We're also taught to not speak bad about elders and spiritual leaders. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes some of those individuals across the state, across the country, have been part of the problem. So part of my message is around, where are the safe people, and how do we teach our communities um, how to interview safe people, right? How to interview a therapist, how to interview that spiritual leader to make sure that they're safe, right? And if we don't arm our communities with that, some of these predators and these situations end up being um, attractive, right? And we get lost in those pieces sometimes. In terms of, that it's hard to lead change, when we haven't done this healing work ourselves. I've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, as is my entire family, working on recovery issues. And one of the things my mom talked about was, it's going to be really hard to facilitate change if we're stuck in systems that are still hurting people. So if I'm stuck in a system of being battered, sexually assaulted in a relationship or an addiction, it's going to be really hard to help other people because I'm stuck myself, right? And we've got a lot of people in our community that are hurting, that are pretty wounded and haven't done some of that work themselves. And so we think about, how do we move our community along to have these conversations when there's so much pain attached, when we have to find safe places to feel the rage, um, the pain and incredible grief that goes along with, taking a look at the numbers that Nicole, that you mentioned, right? This is something that we should all be grieving about. So the recovery work is incredibly hard. There's cost to stepping out. Um, our community was watching this article pretty closely, I can tell you that, in terms of, as we the rumors in our communities go out pretty quickly. And people were wondering, what is going to be said, and are people going to be, are their names going to be mentioned in terms of those that are still harming other people? And my partner, my spouse, wrote a piece in this article and disclosed some things about his historical upbringing, and being and harming women himself, 50 years ago. And in our communities, we don't talk about that. We need men as partners in this work of creating that safety where we can talk about missing, murdered Indigenous relatives, if we're going to find those safe places, for people to come to. And right now in central Minnesota, there aren't a lot of safe places. In Brainerd, Minnesota, Mille Band, we're starting to break that ice. We've got a county attorney in Brainerd who is willing to have the conversation, and she's got guts, she's got background, she's got integrity, and she's willing to have the conversation and do the hard work. Kimberly Pilgrim, who is in the session here today, is the director of the Family Resiliency Program, the Meta 5 program, which is housed at Central Lakes College, working with women that have been trafficked, and others that were noted in our article. We've got some things that are beginning to happen. We also have women that are being moved around, and teenagers that are being moved around at the local isolated McDonald's and out on the lakes and the fish houses, and people know. And again, breaking some of those cycles of that secrecy, we really need help with. And this edition of the press, I again want to say miigwech, because it's historical, and it's groundbreaking, and in a rural community, it is going to be life-saving, and people are talking, and this has been really, really important. So I'm honored to have played a real small role in this work, and we need to continue. So miigwech, thank you.